The billionaire heard the maid's toddler humming one song, then he broke down. One moment changed everything. He didn't hear the piano. He didn't hear the maids moving through the hallway, or the soft hum of the air conditioning cooling a house too big for one man. He heard a 3-year-old girl humming 4 notes he hadn't heard in 26 years. And in that instant, standing in the middle of his own living room, a man worth $11 billion felt his knees go weak. He pressed his hand to his chest like he was trying to keep his heart from falling out of it. Because that melody wasn't supposed to exist anymore. He'd buried it. He'd buried her. And now a child he'd never met was singing his mother back to life. Hey, before we get into this one, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your country in the comments. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. This one is a little different from the others we've told. It's about grief that hides in silence for decades, about a song that survives long after the person who sang it is gone, and about a man who thought he'd never feel anything again, until a toddler in a yellow dress opened her mouth and cracked him wide open. Stay with me. This one gets deep. The Hart estate had 11 bedrooms and not one of them felt like home. Daniel Hart was 34 years old, and by every measure that mattered to the outside world, he had already won. He'd taken his father's mid-sized investment firm and turned it into something that made headlines. Hart Capital, a name whispered in boardrooms from Manhattan to Singapore. He had the cars, the jet, the Steinway grand piano in the music room that nobody played, and a calendar so full that his assistant scheduled his meals between meetings. What he didn't have was anyone who called him just to see how he was doing. He liked it that way. Or he told himself he did. The truth was quieter and colder than that. Daniel had built a life with no soft edges on purpose, because soft edges were where things got in. Where they hurt you. He'd learned that lesson at 8 years old, standing in a hospital hallway in a suit too small for him, watching his father shake hands with people who kept saying "so sorry for your loss" like it was a phrase they'd rehearsed. His mother, Margaret Hart, had died in the spring he turned 8, and something in Daniel had closed like a door that spring too. It never fully opened again. 26 years later, the house on Hartwell Lane ran like a machine. A staff of 12 kept it spotless, silent, and exactly the way Daniel liked it, which was to say, untouched by anything that felt like a real life. He ate dinner alone at a table that sat 14. He walked past the music room every night on his way to bed and never once looked inside. Then, on a grey Tuesday in early spring, his longtime housekeeper retired, and the agency sent a replacement. Her name was Elena Ramos. She was 30 years old, with tired eyes that still managed to be kind, dark hair always pulled back in a practical knot, and hands that moved like she'd been working since she could walk. She arrived exactly on time, in a plain grey uniform, carrying a resume that Daniel didn't bother to read because his estate manager, Mr. Whitfield, had already vetted her. She was polite. She was thorough. She stayed out of his way, which was the only requirement Daniel had ever given anyone. For the first 2 weeks, Daniel barely registered her existence. She was a presence in the periphery of his life, a vacuum running somewhere upstairs, a faint smell of lemon polish in the hallway, dishes that appeared clean and disappeared again without him ever seeing hands touch them. That was how he liked his staff. Invisible. Efficient. Silent. He had no idea that Elena went home every night to a cramped 1-bedroom apartment 19 minutes away, where a 3-year-old girl named Sophia waited for her at the door, arms out, asking the same question every single evening. "Did you sing today, Mama?" Elena always said the same thing back. "I sing every day, Mija." Just very, very quietly. Because the truth was, Elena Ramos hadn't sung out loud in a long time either. Not since her own mother passed. Some songs, she'd learned, were too heavy to carry into rooms where people might ask where they came from. She had no idea that the biggest house she'd ever worked in was about to ask her that exact question. Some doors only open by accident. The trouble started on a Thursday, the way trouble in ordinary lives usually does. Small, inconvenient, and completely out of anyone's control. Elena's regular babysitter, her elderly neighbor Mrs. Alvarez, called at 6 in the morning with a voice thick with congestion and apologized for the 3rd time in a row that she simply couldn't watch Sophia that day. Elena stood in her kitchen with the phone against her ear and felt her stomach drop. She had no backup. No family nearby. Her mother had passed 4 years ago, her father long gone before that, and her sister lived 2 states away with 3 kids of her own and no room to spare. A missed shift meant a missed day's pay, and a missed day's pay meant choosing between the electric bill and groceries. Elena had done that math too many times already this year. So she did the only thing she could think of. She called Mr. Whitfield and asked, voice shaking slightly, if there was any possibility, just this once, that she could bring her daughter with her. She promised Sophia would be quiet. She promised she'd keep her in the staff kitchen the entire time, out of sight, out of the way. Mr. Whitfield hesitated. Mr. Hart did not like surprises in his house. But Elena was reliable, and firing a good housekeeper over one difficult morning felt short-sighted even to a man as cautious as Whitfield. He agreed, on the condition that Mr. Hart never had to know the child was there. That was the plan. Keep Sophia hidden. Keep the house running exactly as it always did. Nobody would even notice. Sophia Ramos had other ideas, not out of mischief, but simply because she was 3, and 3-year-olds do not understand invisible boundaries drawn by nervous adults. She was a small, curious girl with a tumble of dark curls and an obsession with anything shiny, anything that made a sound, anything that felt like magic. Elena had settled her at the small table in the staff kitchen with crayons and a coloring book, whispered, "Stay right here, baby, Mama loves you," and gone off to finish the West Wing bathrooms. 15 minutes later, when Elena came back to check on her, the chair was empty. Elena's heart lurched. She moved fast down the hallway, calling Sophia's name under her breath, careful not to be too loud, terrified of what would happen if Mr. Hart discovered a toddler wandering his 11,000-square-foot house uninvited. She checked the sitting room, the library, the hallway of family portraits nobody ever looked at. She found her standing in the doorway of the music room. Sophia was staring at the piano the way some children stare at the ocean for the first time, completely still, completely transfixed. Sunlight came through the tall windows and lit up the black lacquer of the Steinway like glass. And before Elena could grab her hand and pull her away, before she could whisper the apology already forming on her lips, Sophia opened her mouth. And she began to hum. Nobody in that house was ready for 4 small notes to break a man wide open. Daniel had been in his study down the hall, reviewing a contract he didn't care about, when the sound reached him. At first he thought it was nothing, a bird outside, maybe, or a draft through an old window. But it came again, clearer this time, drifting down the corridor like something carried on the wind. A melody. Simple. For notes climbing, then falling, then climbing again, in a pattern so specific, so exact, that his entire body went cold before his mind even understood why. He stood up from his desk without deciding to. His legs carried him into the hallway before his thoughts caught up with his feet. He followed the sound the way a man follows a memory he thought he'd lost, helplessly, urgently, like if he stopped walking it might disappear again. He reached the music room and stopped in the doorway. There was a little girl standing beside his piano in a plain cotton dress, humming a tune Daniel Hart had not heard since he was 8 years old. A tune with no name that anyone had ever written down. A tune his mother used to hum to him every single night before bed, her hand smoothing his hair, her voice low and warm, promising him that no matter what happened, she would always find her way back to him. Little Sparrow, she used to call it, not a real song, just something she'd made up, something that belonged only to the 2 of them. Margaret Hart had died 3 months after the last time she sang it to him. And Daniel had never heard it again. Not once. Not from a radio, not from a music box, not from anyone in 26 years. He had convinced himself, somewhere along the way, that it had died with her, that the melody existed only in the part of his memory he refused to visit anymore. Now it was floating out of a 3-year-old's mouth in his own living room, and Daniel Hart, a man who had not cried at his own mother's funeral because his father told him men didn't do that, felt his chest cave inward. His hand rose on its own and pressed flat against his sternum, as though he could hold himself together by force. His breath went shallow. His vision blurred at the edges. Elena turned and saw him standing there, pale, frozen, staring at her daughter like he'd seen a ghost. "Mr. Hart, I am so sorry," she said quickly, already moving to scoop Sophia up into her arms. She wandered off. "I only turned my back for a second. Please, it won't happen." "Where?" Daniel said, and his voice came out cracked, unrecognizable even to himself. "Did she learn that song?" Elena blinked, thrown completely off balance by the question. I don't know. I mean, I sing it to her sometimes. At home. It's just something my mother used to hum. I don't even know where it's from." Daniel's whole world tilted sideways. "That's impossible," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "That song doesn't exist anywhere. My mother made it up." She never sang it to anyone but me. The room went silent except for Sophia, who, completely unaware that she had just cracked open a wound 26 years old, reached her small arms toward the piano and said, in the simple, direct way only a toddler can, "Pretty song. Sing more." Some questions take 26 years to finally get asked. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He sat in the dark of his study with a glass of scotch he never touched, replaying the sound of that melody over and over until it felt less like a memory and more like a haunting. By morning he had made a decision he never would have made a week earlier. He asked Mr. Whitfield to find Elena before her shift began and bring her to his office. Elena arrived nervous, hands clasped in front of her, certain she was about to be let go for the incident with Sophia. Instead, Daniel gestured for her to sit, and asked her, gently this time, to tell him everything she knew about the song. Elena thought for a long moment. "It's not really a song," she said slowly. "It doesn't have words. My mother used to hum it while she worked, cleaning, cooking, whatever she was doing. I always thought she made it up herself. She used to say it was a song for people who needed comforting. She taught it to me before she passed, and I guess I just started humming it to Sophia without thinking. It's the only lullaby I know that feels like it's really mine." "What was your mother's name?" Daniel asked, and something in his voice made Elena go very still. "Rosa," she said. "Rosa Delgado." Daniel closed his eyes. He remembered the name the way you remember a word in a language you haven't spoken in decades. Buried, but not gone. Rosa. There had been a woman by that name in the house when he was a child, hired during the final year of his mother's illness, a private caretaker who sat with Margaret Hart through her worst nights when the household staff couldn't bear to. Daniel had been too young then to understand what dying looked like up close, but he remembered a woman with a soft voice who used to hum something in his mother's room late at night, when he was supposed to be asleep down the hall and instead crept to the door to listen. "Your mother worked here," Daniel said slowly, testing the words as they left his mouth. "A long time ago. She took care of my mother while she was sick." Elena's eyes widened. That can't be a coincidence." "I don't think it is," Daniel said. He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the grounds without really seeing them, his mind 11 and 26 years old at once. "My mother used to hum a melody to me every night before bed. She called it Little Sparrow. She told me she made it up herself, that it was ours, that nobody else in the world knew it." His voice thinned. "But if your mother learned it from mine, in that room, during those last months, then it wasn't just ours. It was something my mother gave to the one person who was there for her when the rest of us were too afraid to be." Elena pressed a hand to her mouth, tears rising fast and unexpected. "My mother never told me where it came from. She just said it was a song for people who needed comforting, and that she'd learned it from someone very special, a long time ago, who deserved to be remembered." The two of them stood in a room full of money and silence, connected suddenly by something neither of their bank accounts could explain. A melody passed hand to hand, mother to daughter again, surviving 2 deaths and 26 years to land in a 3-year-old's mouth in the one house where it had first been born. Grief doesn't disappear. It just waits for permission. That night, for the first time in over 2 decades, Daniel Hart walked into his mother's old sitting room, a space on the 3rd floor that had been locked and untouched since her death, preserved not out of sentiment but because nobody had ever had the courage to decide what to do with it. He asked Mr. Whitfield for the key. His hands shook slightly as he turned it in the lock. Dust hung in the air like a held breath. Sheets covered the furniture. But her writing desk was still there, exactly as it had been, and inside the top drawer, Daniel found a leather journal he had never seen in his life. He sat down on the dusty floor in his $3,000 suit and read his mother's handwriting for the first time in 26 years. The entries from her final year were the hardest to read. She wrote about her fear, not of dying, but of Daniel forgetting her, of him growing up without a single soft memory to hold on to in a house that was already, even then, cold and transactional. And then, near the end, she wrote about Rosa. About the caretaker who sat with her through the worst nights, who never once made her feel like a burden, who hummed an old tune from her own childhood to help Margaret fall asleep when the pain wouldn't let her rest. "I taught it back to her tonight." One entry read, "The little melody I made up for Daniel. I told her, if anything ever happens to me, please remember it. Please don't let it disappear. Some things should survive us." Daniel sat on that floor for over an hour, journal open in his lap, and cried for the first time since he was 8 years old, Not the careful, controlled kind of crying men are taught is acceptable, but the kind that shakes a person from the inside out. He cried for the mother he'd lost too young. He cried for the boy who'd been told grief was weakness. He cried because somewhere out there, without either of them knowing it, a promise his mother made to a stranger 26 years ago had just walked back into his life wearing a yellow dress and asking for more of a song. He didn't tell Elena about the journal the next morning. He wasn't ready yet. But something in him had shifted permanently, like tectonic plates settling into a new shape after decades of pressure. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Daniel Hart wanted to feel things instead of managing them. Not everyone wants old wounds reopened. Word travels fast in a house with 12 staff members, and it wasn't long before Daniel's stepmother, Vivian, heard that her stepson had spent an evening locked in Margaret's old sitting room. Vivian had married Daniel's father, Robert, 3 years after Margaret's death, and in the 2 decades since, she had worked very hard to make sure the first Mrs. Hart existed only as a portrait nobody looked at and a name nobody said out loud at dinner. She arrived at the estate unannounced the following afternoon, heels sharp against the marble floor, expression tight. "I hear you've been playing detective in your mother's old things," Vivian said, settling into a chair across from Daniel's desk without being invited. "And I hear it has something to do with the housekeeper's child." "Her name is Sophia," Daniel said evenly. "And yes." Vivian's mouth thinned. "Daniel, I understand this feels significant to you. But you cannot let sentiment override sense. That woman works for you. Her daughter humming a tune does not make her family." "It's not about family," Daniel said, though even as he said it, he wasn't entirely sure that was true anymore. "It's about a promise my mother made to someone who cared for her when no one else would. Rosa Delgado sat with her through the worst of it. Vivian, where were you?" The question landed harder than he intended, and for a moment something flickered across Vivian's face. Not guilt exactly, but something close to old resentment finally surfacing. "I wasn't here yet," she said stiffly. "I didn't know your mother." "No," Daniel said quietly. "But you knew how much it hurt me to talk about her. And instead of helping me carry that, you helped me bury it. You had her portraits moved to the East Wing. You told the staff never to mention her name at dinner. You let me grow up thinking grief was something shameful." Vivian stood, visibly rattled. "I was trying to help you move forward." "You were trying to make yourself comfortable," Daniel said, and though his voice never rose, something in it had grown a spine it hadn't had in years. "I found her journal, Vivian. I know what my mother wanted. For people to remember her, not erase her. And for the first time in 26 years, someone in this house is helping me do that instead of stopping me." Vivian left without another word, her heels sharp and furious against the marble on her way out. But she did not leave the estate grounds without a plan quietly forming behind her eyes, because Vivian Hart had spent 2 decades curating the story of this family, and she had no intention of losing control of it to a housekeeper's toddler and an old, half-remembered lullaby. Standing up for someone is its own kind of love letter. In the days that followed, something in the house began, quietly, to change. Daniel found himself lingering near the music room in the evenings, no longer walking past it with his eyes forward. He started asking Mr. Whitfield, almost sheepishly, whether Elena might be bringing Sophia in again, and when the answer was no, he found himself oddly disappointed. He began seeking Elena out, not for household matters, but for conversation. He learned that she had been a nursing student before her mother's illness forced her to drop out and take whatever work would pay the bills. He learned that Sophia's father had left before she was born, and that Elena had built an entire life for her daughter out of double shifts, second-hand furniture, and sheer stubborn love. He learned that despite everything, Elena still hummed that same wordless melody to Sophia every single night, the way her mother had hummed it to her, a small, private inheritance passed down through women who had nothing else certain to give. Daniel began to understand something he'd never let himself consider before, that the people who worked in his house were not furniture. They were entire lives, entire histories, running parallel to his own, mostly invisible to him because he had never once bothered to look. Vivian, true to the plan simmering behind her composed exterior, made her move on a Friday afternoon. She approached Mr. Whitfield directly, bypassing Daniel entirely, and suggested, with the practiced smoothness of someone used to getting her way, that perhaps it was time to reassess Elena's position. "Too many personal distractions," she said. "Bringing a child into the workplace, however sympathetic the circumstances, set a poor precedent. Perhaps a generous severance and a recommendation letter would resolve things cleanly for everyone. Whitfield, uneasy but unwilling to defy Vivian outright given her long history with the family, mentioned it to Daniel almost apologetically, framing it as something worth considering. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He simply picked up the phone and called Vivian directly. "If Elena Ramos is let go from this house," he said, "for any reason connected to her daughter, I will personally make sure my father hears exactly why, including the part where you tried to erase my mother's memory for 2 decades and got caught doing it again. Elena stays. Sophia is welcome here whenever Elena needs her to be. That's not a request. Vivian. That's the last conversation we're going to have about it." He hung up before she could respond, and for the first time in his adult life, Daniel Hart felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest where the old cold weight used to sit. It felt, strangely, like relief. Healing doesn't announce itself. It just quietly starts happening. Spring rolled into early summer, and the Hart estate began, in small and unremarkable ways, to feel like somewhere people actually lived. Sophia became a regular, welcomed presence. Elena no longer hid her away in the staff kitchen but let her toddle freely through the halls, and Daniel, to the quiet astonishment of his entire staff, started arranging his schedule around the hours Sophia was in the house. He taught her to press single keys on the Steinway, delighted every time she squealed at the sound. He learned that she liked her apple slices cut into stars, that she refused to nap without a particular threadbare stuffed rabbit, that she called him Mr. Dano because his full name was too many syllables for her patience. Somewhere in the middle of all these small, ordinary things, Daniel realized he was happier than he had been in over 2 decades. Happier not because anything spectacular had happened, but because his house had finally stopped being silent. Elena noticed the change in him too. The tightness around his eyes had softened. He laughed now, sometimes, actually laughed, a sound the household staff quietly admitted to each other they hadn't heard in years. She found herself looking forward to their conversations in the evenings after Sophia had fallen asleep on the study couch, the two of them talking quietly about nothing important. Books, weather, the ache of losing a parent too soon, the strange, specific loneliness of being surrounded by people and still feeling entirely alone. Neither of them said the word out loud, but something was growing between them that had nothing to do with an employer and an employee, and everything to do with 2 people who had spent years building walls finally finding someone worth taking them down for. Daniel gave Elena and Sophia one of the smaller guest cottages on the property to stay in, insisting it made sense given how often Sophia was there now, though everyone in the house understood it was really about something else entirely. He set up a proper piano bench next to the Steinway, low enough for a 3-year-old to reach the keys. He started calling his mother's old sitting room Margaret's room out loud, without flinching, and one afternoon he showed Elena the journal, reading her the entry about Rosa with a steadiness in his voice that surprised even him. "My mother wanted to be remembered," he told her. "For 26 years, I thought that meant grief. But maybe it just meant this. Sophia humming that song. You being here. Maybe remembering someone isn't about staying sad. Maybe it's about letting them keep showing up in your life, in whatever way they can." Elena reached over and took his hand, and for the first time in longer than either of them could recall, neither one of them let go first. Just when it feels safe, the ground shifts. It was Elena, not Vivian, who almost ended it all, not out of malice, but out of fear. One evening, after another quiet dinner in the small cottage with Sophia asleep in the next room, Elena finally said the thing she'd been holding back for weeks. "Daniel, I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually think about it before you answer." He set down his coffee. "Okay. What are we doing?" she asked. "Because I clean your house for a living. My daughter and I live in your guest cottage. Every single day, I wonder if people look at us and think I planned this, that I brought my daughter in here on purpose, hummed some little song, and worked my way into Billionaire's life. I can't live like that, Daniel. I can't have people whispering that Sophia is some kind of accident that turned into a payday. I won't do that to her." Daniel opened his mouth, but Elena kept going, faster now, the fear spilling out. "And it's not just what other people think. It's, Daniel, I'm a housekeeper. You are a billionaire. Those worlds are not supposed to fit together, and someday you're going to wake up and realize how strange this all is, and I refuse to be the person standing there when that happens. I'd rather leave now, while Sophia is too young to remember any of it, than stay and watch this fall apart later." She stood up, and for a terrifying moment, Daniel thought she meant to walk out the door and keep walking. Pack up the cottage, take Sophia, and disappear from his life the same quiet, unassuming way she had first arrived in it. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to either of them, Vivian had made one final attempt at that very outcome. Quietly contacting a tabloid contact with a tip about the housekeeper's daughter cozying up to the Hart fortune, hoping public embarrassment would do what direct interference hadn't. A gossip site picked up a version of the story within hours, cruel and half-true, painting Elena as calculating and Sophia's presence as strategy rather than accident. Elena saw the article on her phone before Daniel did, and it confirmed every fear she'd just spoken out loud. She sat on the edge of the cottage bed with Sophia sleeping beside her and began, quietly, to pack a bag. Some love has to be chosen twice. Daniel found out about the article 40 minutes later, and he found the packed bag 10 minutes after that, standing in the cottage doorway watching Elena fold Sophia's small yellow dresses with shaking hands. "Don't," he said simply. "Daniel, look at what they're saying about us. About her." Elena's voice cracked. "I told you this would happen." "Then we prove them wrong," he said, stepping closer. "Not by you leaving. By you staying, and by me saying it out loud where everyone can hear it, so there's no story left for anyone to twist." He knelt down in front of her, taking the folded dress gently out of her hands. "Elena, I'm not confused about what this is. I've spent 26 years numb, going through the motions of a life that never felt like mine. And then a 3-year-old hummed my mother back into this house, and you walked in right behind her. And for the first time since I was 8 years old, I have felt like a whole person instead of a machine wearing a suit." He reached into his jacket and pulled out his mother's journal, worn soft now from handling. "My mother wrote that some things should survive us. I used to think she meant memory. Now I think she meant love, the kind that gets passed hand to hand, generation to generation, even between people who never expected to find each other. Rosa gave that song to your mother. Your mother gave it to you. You gave it to Sophia. And somehow, impossibly, it found its way back to the one house it started in. That's not a coincidence, Elena. That's my mother, still taking care of me, 26 years later, the only way she had left." By morning, Daniel had issued a public statement correcting the tabloid story in full, explaining, with more vulnerability than he'd ever shown a stranger, exactly who Rosa Delgado had been to his family, and exactly what her daughter and granddaughter meant to him now. Vivian's involvement came to light not long after, and Robert Hart, hearing the full story for the first time, quietly and finally cut ties with the version of family Vivian had spent 2 decades constructing. 6 months later, in the music room where it all began, Daniel Hart sat at the Steinway with Sophia perched beside him on the bench, her small fingers finding the keys while Elena watched from the doorway, laughing at something only the two of them understood. He played 4 notes. Then Sophia hummed them back. And for a house that had been silent for 26 years, that small, imperfect duet was the loudest, fullest sound it had ever held. Grief, Daniel had learned, doesn't ask permission to leave. It waits, sometimes for decades, for someone brave enough to open the door again. And love, the real, patient, generational kind, has a way of finding its way home, even when it has to travel through 2 lifetimes and a stranger's kindness to get there. If this story moved you even a little, that's exactly why we tell them. Give it a like if you believe some songs, and some people, are worth remembering. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one landing in your feed. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that love finds its way home eventually, send this their way. Thank you for staying until the very end. We'll see you in the next one.